Welcome to episode 7 in our video series about the Founding Fathers of the United States of America. Now, if you've been watching some of the prior videos in the series, you know that this video series is not some dull recitation of dusty old facts, but instead, we are having some fun here. So we are considering the context of the time and the situations that confronted these founding fathers. And we see what our founding fathers believed and what they did. So this is giving us a real sense of what these founding fathers were like as people, what they were really like as human beings. And we're also gaining a wonderful perspective on the fascinating story of how this nation was founded. So in our prior videos, we established our big board. And we are using this big board here to keep track of the 5 central founding fathers that we are focusing on during this video series. So you see our 5 central founding fathers here, and also you see a couple of additions here. So you see the blue line connecting Washington with Hamilton. And that blue line is signifying that these two guys, Washington and Hamilton, were super close and they were super aligned with each other, and they agreed with each other in their perspectives on government. And then you see the blue arrow down at the bottom of the screen. And that is representing the complete reversal that James Madison did. So initially, James Madison was aligned with the vision of Alexander Hamilton. And James Madison believed in this strong central government. But then James Madison completely reversed himself and he jumped over to join Thomas Jefferson in the opposing political party. It's pretty amazing. So you also see the red curved line in the center of our big board here, and that red curved line represents the conflict posed by the 2 opposing political parties. So on one end of the red line, you have Alexander Hamilton, who founded the Federalist Party that believed in a strong, centralized federal government. And on the other end of this curved red line, we have Thomas Jefferson, who created the opposing political party, the Democratic Republicans. And they did not believe in a strong central federal government, but they believed more along the lines of states' rights. In the prior video, episode 6, we saw the creation of these 2 political parties and how these 2 political parties were opposed to each other. So let's pick it up from there and let's consider how these 2 political parties were continuing the conflict against each other. So let's jump right in to episode 7. There is a great story illustrating the struggles that were going on between these 2 political parties. And it had to do with the location of the capital city for the nation. So we all know today that the capital is Washington, D.C. But how did it get to be that way? How was it that Washington, D.C. was selected to be the capital city? Well, it turns out that this was a matter of significant controversy and dispute between these 2 parties, between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. So, does anybody know what the first capital was of the United States? So what city was the first capital of the United States? So this was in 1788. The Constitution is ratified. So now all of a sudden the government exists. So they formed Congress and they started the presidential election. But where was this all happening from? Does anybody know? Now some might say Washington, D.C. And that is a perfectly rational choice because Washington is the capital today. So perhaps it was the capital back then too. But it was not. Washington, D.C. was not the first capital of the United States. Any other guesses? Some might say Philadelphia. And that is an excellent guess because a lot was going on in Philadelphia, including the Constitutional Convention, right? These delegates kept coming back to Philadelphia and meeting in Independence Hall. The Continental Congress was meeting in Philadelphia, right, before the Constitution was ratified. So Philadelphia is a good guess. But in fact, it wasn't Philadelphia either. So it turns out that the first capital of the United States was none other than New York City. Now, this is surprising to many people because New York City is not often associated with the founding of this nation or the founding fathers of that time period back then. But in fact, New York City did have a lot of history with the founding of this nation. So the first capital of this nation, 1788, when the Constitution was ratified and the first Congress got together and the president was elected and all that, the capital of the nation was New York City. So where in New York City did this all happen? Well, it turns out that it happened in the area of Wall Street. Here's an aerial view of New York City. So this is the island of Manhattan. Here you have the Hudson River to the west. You've got the East River down here. You've got Central Park up here. You've got Midtown Manhattan with all these tall buildings here. And down here is Brooklyn, the Brooklyn Bridge connecting Brooklyn to Manhattan. And down here is our area of focus. So this is the southern tip of Manhattan with all these tall buildings. This is the Wall Street area. And this is where all the action occurred with respect to our founding fathers and the founding of this nation. Here is a close-up look of a map of the area. So this is Wall Street. Right here is Wall Street. And this is the large thoroughfare Broadway. Right here is Trinity Church. So Trinity Church is actually an amazing church. So here's a picture of Trinity Church, and it's just the contrast between then and today is amazing. So this view is looking straight up Wall Street, and Trinity Church is like the capstone right on top of Wall Street, right at the head of Wall Street. But the contrast is amazing because on either side you have these tall skyscrapers, these modern buildings on Wall Street here that are engaged in global finance. And yet at the top of Wall Street you have Trinity Church that has been here for hundreds of years. And in fact, it was there at the time of the founding of this nation. It's amazing. So here is Trinity Church right here. So the view from that picture was looking up Wall Street this way to the Trinity Church, which is right here at the top of Wall Street. And in fact, Trinity Church is the location of the final resting place of Alexander Hamilton. This is where Hamilton is buried. And you can go there today. You can go into the grounds of Trinity Church and you can see Alexander Hamilton's gravestone. It's located along the southern property line in the churchyard. It's pretty amazing. So here, if you take a walk down Wall Street here, just a couple of short blocks, right here is the New York Stock Exchange. This is it, the center of the global stock exchanges. So here's a look at the building here. This is the iconic New York Stock Exchange building. So this is the center of global finance and global capitalism. So inside of this building is you've got all these traders and specialists and trading pits and screens with financial data, and they're all, trading fast and furiously back and forth. So it is right here, right on Wall Street, is the New York Stock Exchange. But it is amazing to think that just steps from the stock exchange, right across the street, is Federal Hall. And Federal Hall was the first capital of the United States. It was right here. This was the capital of the United States after the Constitution was ratified. So right here, this was the first capital, Federal Hall. So here's a look of it. This is Federal Hall. Now, it was not the same building as back then because the original building was destroyed, so they rebuilt this building still for government use, but it wasn't the same building. But it was the exact same location. So here is a statue of George Washington. And the reason this statue is here is because this is the location where George Washington was sworn in as the very first president of the United States. Right here. And this happened in 1789. Now, the building that existed back then had a second floor balcony. And this is where the ceremony took place. So George Washington walked out onto the second floor balcony along with all the dignitaries. Note that you can see Trinity Church there in the background. And on the second floor here is where the swearing in took place. So this statue is representative of very close to where the location would have been. As you can see, it's elevated up. So roughly the second floor of this old building here is right where George Washington was sworn in. And at the time, there were people all on the streets who had come to witness this first inauguration. So it's pretty amazing. So here is a closer look of the statue of George Washington here out in front of Federal Hall. And this is the approximate location of where he was sworn in. So you can just imagine from this perspective of the picture of being a citizen in the street, looking up here, this is what you would have seen to George Washington standing on the second floor of Federal Hall being sworn in as the first president of the United States. But it's amazing to see how close this is to the New York Stock Exchange. I mean, it's right here, right on Wall Street, right? And here's the Stock Exchange. And when we don't think about, we don't associate Wall Street with the founding of America. We associate Wall Street with the Stock Exchange. But this was the location of the founding of the American government, right here, Federal Hall. So here's another look of it. So this is the same statue of George Washington. So this is a perspective from behind George Washington from the steps of Federal Hall. And you can see how close the New York Stock Exchange is. I mean, it is just steps from each other. It is amazing. In fact, it's kind of funny because a lot of tourists who come to New York City come to see Wall Street. So they come down, they walk down Wall Street, they come out here, and they come to see the New York Stock Exchange right here. But they don't realize that right here was where George Washington was sworn in as the first president, and that this was the location of the first capital of the United States. It's pretty funny. So this picture also offers a good perspective because it gives you a sense of what it was like to be at the inauguration, right? So we're standing up here on the second floor, elevated above street level. This is where George Washington approximately would have been standing when he was sworn in. And you can just imagine, certainly you didn't have these skyscrapers back then, but you would have had throngs of thousands of people in the streets, hanging out windows on tops of buildings, all here witnessing this historic first inauguration of George Washington. And after George Washington took his oath, the administrator turned to the crowd and said, "Long live George Washington, President of the United States!" And the crowd goes wild, big roar of the crowd, yay! And people are like firing their guns in salute, and it's a raucous scene here. So this was the inauguration right here of George Washington. Pretty amazing. So it wasn't just the inauguration of George Washington that occurred here. This building was the first Capitol building. So it was the home of Congress. So Congress was meeting here in this location. So, this was the first Congress, right? Congress had just been established, the very first Congress, so it was doing all the business of forming government. And in fact, it drafted much of the Bill of Rights right here, right? This is where they were, negotiating and drafting and writing the Bill of Rights right here in this location. And all these founding fathers lived here as well, right? So Alexander Hamilton lived right on Wall Street. So he lived just steps from this location. And Thomas Jefferson had a place on Maiden Lane, which is just a couple blocks north. So you just walk a couple blocks north and Maiden Lane comes right there. So Jefferson was just a couple blocks nearby. And And George Washington, he had a place on Cherry Street, which is a few blocks northeast. Right, so these guys all lived here. Now, certainly, Washington and Jefferson, they maintained their plantations in Virginia as well, but they kept residences here, and they would come and live here for portions of the year because this was the capital. This is where Congress was meeting. So it's pretty amazing to think that right here was where George Washington was sworn in as the first president, and this was the very first location of the first Congress of the United States, and it was the first capital of the United States, right here on Wall Street. So the first capital of the nation was in New York City. But right from the start, the parties were talking about relocating it to someplace else. So this was the source of a big controversy between these two parties, between Hamilton and the Federalists and Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans. So the issue was, Hamilton wanted to keep the capital in New York City or someplace north, like Philadelphia. He was fine with the capital being in Philadelphia. And the reason is he wanted the capital to be up north, close to the center of commerce and the center of this vision that he had for developing this strong financial federal system. But this was very alarming to those in the South. So Jefferson and Madison and their party, right, all these people in the South, they did not want the capital to be located up north because they felt excluded. So they felt like, okay, Hamilton wants to create this strong federal financial system that favors industries in the north. So that right there is favoring the north. But then if you also locate the capital in the north, well, then you're excluding the South basically entirely from everything. And the South is really going to be in trouble. So the Southerners were very much opposed to having the capital be located in someplace up north. So what happened? How did they break this logjam? Well, there was a dinner. So it was Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson hosts a dinner in the summer of 1790 at his place in New York City. So this was Jefferson's place on Maiden Lane, just a couple blocks north of Wall Street, right? Just a couple blocks from Federal Hall, right? So who does Jefferson have over to his place? Jefferson has over James Madison. So this is Jefferson's buddy, James Madison, both of the Democratic Republican Party. And they have over Alexander Hamilton from the Federalists. So you've got these two opposing parties here coming to dinner at Jefferson's house. So it's Jefferson, Madison, and Hamilton. So they come to dinner at Jefferson's and they start hashing out all of this stuff, all these big ticket issues, right? So the implications of trying to, Hamilton's vision, Hamilton felt very strongly that he wanted to create this strong federal financial system. So you have Hamilton talking about that. You've got Jefferson talking about the South and that the South needed to, maintain its agricultural industry. And, you have them talking about the differences between the North and the South and, all of these sort of, big ticket issues and where the capital should be located, all of this stuff. So they're hashing all this stuff out. And at this dinner, they reach a grand compromise. Okay, so what was the compromise? Well, the compromise was Hamilton got what he wanted in his grand vision for creating this federal financial system by Jefferson and Madison agreeing that they would allow the federal government to assume the war debts, right? This was huge. This was like the essence of creating this strong federal government. And then from that would flow the creation of the national bank and the creation of a national mint that would print money and all this stuff that was part of Hamilton's vision. But the huge big step was having the federal government assume these war debts. So Hamilton got what he wanted in that, so that the federal government would be permitted to assume the war debts. But in exchange, the capital city for the nation would have to be relocated down south. So to a location in the South. So this was a grand compromise, and it must have been extremely difficult for both sides, right? Extremely difficult for Jefferson and Madison to agree to the federal government assuming the war debt. Oh my gosh, that's huge. You're creating this federal government. But at the same time, it must have been so difficult for Hamilton to allow the capital city to be relocated down south, because he had this vision of, creating this financial system, and he wanted the capital to be right in the heart of the financial system. So this was difficult for both sides, but that was the grand compromise. Amazing. And it was all done at the dinner hosted by Jefferson. Amazing. So at this dinner, they did not pick the exact location of Washington, D.C. They picked the proximity and along the Potomac River down there, but they didn't pick the exact location. So what they did was they said, hey, let's appoint George Washington. So George Washington was president then. Let's appoint George Washington, and let's let Washington pick the exact site of the Capitol. So that's what happens. So Washington picks a place that's very close to his own plantation, right? His plantation is Mount Vernon, which is in Alexandria, Virginia, or just south of Alexandria. So Alexandria is a suburb of D.C., basically. It's just south of D.C. So George Washington's location is he picks the location just up the river from him, Washington, D.C. So that is how the location of Washington, D.C. was selected. And then they gave George Washington all this power and authority to, appoint this commission and oversee the construction of this city. And it really was the construction of an entirely new city. So at the time, it was like just this swampy backland. So this required, the bringing in a bunch of landfill and building up the land and building the White House, building the Capitol for the Congress, building this whole sort of city, which would be the capital of the entire nation, the seat of government. So Washington is in charge of, overseeing the development of Washington, D.C. It's pretty extraordinary. So another aspect about this Grand Compromise was it did have a suggestion about slavery. So it didn't say anything expressly about slavery, but the implication was that if the people in the North were allowing the capital city for the entire nation to be located in the South, in slavery country, then this was sort of a quiet acknowledgement that the North was not going to be forcing this issue of abolishing slavery onto the South. So the capital was located right on the border of Maryland and Virginia. These were two huge slave states, right? So this gave the Southerners comfort that the North was not going to try to abolish slavery, right? Because otherwise they wouldn't have allowed the capital of the city to be located in the South. So this was sort of in the background here, sort of an undercurrent of this compromise, which is what enabled some of the Northerners then to vote to allow, the expansion of this, some of the Southerners to vote for the expansion of this federal financial system that Hamilton wanted. So it was a pretty amazing compromise in a number of respects. So the plan was to, it sort of looked forward in creating the capital. So at this time, the capital was in New York City. So the plan was, okay, let's relocate the capital to Philadelphia on a temporary basis, and then from Philadelphia, locate the capital to Washington once Washington, D.C. is built. So the idea was, the first capital was New York City in 1788. So then it would be relocated to Philadelphia in 1790. So in New York, it was only 2 years. Then it would be in Philadelphia for 10 years while the capital in D.C. was being built. So it would be in Philadelphia for 10 years from 1790 to 1800. And then 1800, it would move to Washington, D.C., its permanent home. So this is the reason why the nation's capital is located in Washington, D.C. to this day. George Washington was into his second term as the President of the United States. So his first term was in the election of 1788, and that was a 4-year term till 1792. Then in 1792, Washington was re-elected for a second term, so second 4 years would take him to 1796. So Washington was re-elected in 1792. And this election was, again, by overwhelming support for Washington. And the sentiment among almost everybody was, that Washington has got to stay in as president, right? Because again, this government was just beginning. It was just this new government. Nobody knew whether it was going to catch on. Nobody knew whether it would last and whether it would go on and be permanent. It was very tenuous. So the idea of a succession of power was a little concerning, right? Because if Washington stepped down, that would mean you'd have to have a transition of power, and this is where all the trouble happens when transitions of power occur, right? What's going to happen? It could lead to chaos and maybe even the government melting down. So people felt Washington's got to stay on for a second term. He's got to stay in. And also, Washington was this incredibly popular guy. You know, the country loved him. He had all this honor and respect. So he was lending legitimacy to this government as long as he stayed on. So if he did not stay on, it would be, it would be trouble here potentially. So everyone felt like, oh, Washington's got to stay in as president. So this election was overwhelming support. So Washington was elected by a unanimous vote of the Electoral College, which is amazing. So, and this was the same with his first term. So both his first term as the first president of the United States, the first term and the second term, both elections, unanimous vote in the Electoral College. So Washington's, into his second term here. So John Adams stays on as a vice president in the second term as well. So Washington president, John Adams vice president in the second term. So Thomas Jefferson, about a year after that re-election, Thomas Jefferson resigned as the Secretary of State because Thomas Jefferson was undermining Hamilton, and this angered Washington. So Jefferson resigned, so Jefferson was out. Hamilton stayed in with Washington. So Hamilton stayed in as the Secretary of Treasury for a couple more years. But then in 1795, Hamilton voluntarily resigned. So he didn't resign under a dispute or anything, but he stepped down because Hamilton was like, I've got to start making some money for myself here. So remember, Hamilton, he was not one of these founding fathers that inherited great wealth. He didn't have a plantation or some huge inheritance or anything. Hamilton had come to this country as an immigrant with nothing. And then he served all these years in government. He wasn't making a lot of money in his government jobs. So Hamilton's like, look, I've got to start making some money here for myself. I've got a family. I've really got to start focusing on this aspect here. So Hamilton steps down as the Secretary of the Treasury, and he begins to practice law. So this is in order so he can try to make some money here. So Hamilton lives right on Wall Street, so he starts practicing law out of his residence on Wall Street. And he's representing these like wealthy merchants and these wealthy financial clients and that sort of thing. So even though Hamilton was out of government, he certainly kept an iron in the fire. He remained very active in politics and very involved in politics, as did Jefferson. So they were both very active in politics, even though they did not technically own an office or have a title in government. They still remained active. So Washington is progressing on here with his second term as president, and there was an issue in his late term, in his second term, that again just illustrates the difficulty between these two political parties, between the Federalist Party and the Democratic Republican Party. So the issue had to do with this European war that was going on between England and France. So England and France were at war with each other. Now, Washington had already decided that America would remain neutral in that war. So America would not join in that war on either side, on either England or France. America would remain neutral. Okay. However, England started seizing American merchant ships on the high seas. Okay, so this was not American military ships. This was American merchant ships. So these are American citizens and American businesses who were involved in shipping, in trade, right? Shipping across the Atlantic Ocean and trading with Europe and trading with the Caribbean and that sort of thing. So the England military ships were seizing the American merchant ships. So England would seize these ships, would take all the merchandise, and not only that, but England would also take the American sailors who were on this ship and force them into the army, force them into military service for England and fighting this war against France. Okay, so this was impressment. They would impress these sailors into military service, force them to fight in the war on behalf of England. So this was certainly not popular in America, and this was becoming a big problem because it was increasing. England kept doing it over and over again. They were seizing all these ships. It turned out to be hundreds of ships that England had seized, hundreds of American ships. So it's not popular in America, and the people who hated this the most in America were Jefferson and his party, the Democratic Republicans. And the reason they hated this is because, remember, they were partial to France. They favored France in this war anyway. It was the Federalists who favored England, but Jefferson and the Republicans favored France. So when England started seizing these American ships, it was Jefferson and his party who were the most outraged. So they started calling for war. They started saying that America needs to go to war against Britain, right? Because Britain can't be allowed to just seize American ships with no consequences. I mean, imagine if that were happening today. So Jefferson and his party felt like, you know, if they teamed up with France, it would be then America and France against England, that America and France would win this war against England. George Washington, on the other hand, did not feel the same way. So George Washington did not want to go to war, and he did not want to go to war against Britain. So George Washington was, he was the head of the army that just fought a war against Britain, the American Revolutionary War, and he saw how difficult that was. So he was a little worried here that, Britain might win. So Washington did not want to go to war against Britain. Also, Washington favored Britain, right? Because Washington's position was he was more aligned with the Federalist Party on this. Now, Washington technically never joined the Federalist Party because he was trying to be above it. As president, he was trying to say, I'm above being in parties. I'm not going to join any parties. So nominally, he was not involved in a party. He was not a member of a party. But in practice, Washington was very closely aligned with Hamilton and the Federalist Party. He believed in this big federal government and all of that. So Washington actually favored Britain in this situation. So you've got this dispute here going on, what to do about this issue. So what Washington ended up doing was Washington entered into a treaty with England. This is how he solved this. He entered into a treaty. He did not go to war against England. He entered into a treaty with England. So this was in 1795, and it was called the Jay Treaty. So from Washington's perspective, this was a great solution to this problem, right? Because he solved the problem. He got England to agree that they would stop seizing American ships, and he did so peacefully. He avoided war. This was a great thing. So from Washington's perspective, a perfect solution. Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans, on the other hand, were outraged. Okay, they thought this treaty was a horrible idea. Okay, for one thing, Britain just got away with seizing all these ships, right? They seized hundreds of American ships, and what does America do? America doesn't even go to war against them. Doesn't even, there are no consequences for seizing these American ships. So they thought that was bad. But also, they felt like this was trouble because this was America entering into a treaty with England. It was almost like America was now beginning to favor England. And that meant favoring England over France. Okay, so Jefferson and Democratic Republicans were outraged at this. They did not want to favor England over France. They wanted to favor France over England. So France was also outraged at this because France felt the same way. They saw America entering into a friendly treaty with England. This suggested to France that America and England were forming an alliance here. And that was big trouble for France because it was leaving France out in the cold. But Washington insisted, no. America is remaining neutral in this war. America is not joining the side of England. America is not joining any side. The only thing America did was enter into this treaty here on the side in order to stop England from seizing our merchant ships. That's all it is. But we're not entering into the war. Nonetheless, this still outraged Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans, and it outraged France. So Washington's term as president is going on here, and pretty soon his second term is coming to an end. Okay, so this was in 1796, all right? Washington's second term as president is coming to an end. So the question is, what is Washington going to do? Is Washington going to run for a third term as president? Okay, now it seems rational, right? Why not? Washington's, currently president. He's currently this popular president. He's got power. Why wouldn't he continue in the office and continue his power, right? This makes sense. However, Washington does not do it. He does not run for a third term. Instead, Washington voluntarily resigns as president, and he voluntarily gives up power. Okay, this is extraordinary. It is one of the most extraordinary events in world history. Now, this may sound familiar, right? Because, in fact, this is the second time that George Washington has done this. So back in 1783, at the end of the American Revolutionary War, Washington was the head of the army. He had just won the Revolutionary War, kicked out Britain. Washington was perfectly positioned to seize power for himself and become the ruler of this new country, America. But he didn't do that back then. Washington voluntarily resigned his military commission, stepped down from the military, and relinquished power. So that was extraordinary back then, 1783. Now skip ahead, here we are, 1796, and Washington is doing the exact same thing. This is the second time that Washington is voluntarily giving up power. This is extraordinary. It's extraordinary. I mean, again, all throughout history, all around the world, when leaders had come to power, what did they almost always? They would seek to maintain their power and cling to power and do whatever they could to make sure they would stay in power. So for Washington to voluntarily give up power was extraordinary. So this sort of shows that Washington was carrying out this vision of the Founding Fathers. And the vision was that they were creating this democratic government. And it was the government that would rule the people. And it was the government that would survive forever. It was not a government of personalities or of individual people. Like, unlike kingdoms of the past, right? It all depended on the strength of the king. Right? You wanted the strongest king, and if you had a good king, your kingdom would survive. If you had a bad king, it was in trouble. That's not what this new democratic government was all about. The new democratic government was that the government itself would survive, the government itself would rule, and the individual people would just come in and out and rotate in and out, serve in government, but then step out of government, and the government itself is what would govern the people. Right? It's this extraordinary idea, and Washington exemplified this by voluntarily stepping down from power. Right? It was extraordinary. So another thing that this act did was that it set a precedent by example, by Washington's example here of just honor and nobility, of stepping down from power. This set an example for about 150 years for all of these successive presidents. Because Washington was not required to step down at this time. So back then, the Constitution did not have any term limits. Okay, there was no restriction. If the president was reelected, the president could stand for a third term. So there was no requirement that Washington step down. But by stepping down, Washington created this example that served for 150 years, where every president after him for the next 150 years would voluntarily step down after serving only 2 terms. I mean, it was just remarkable that this government would operate that way, that the leader, the guy who had the most power, would voluntarily relinquish power. So this lasted all the way up until the presidency of FDR. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So this was in the 1930s, 1940s. So FDR was this extremely popular president in the Democratic Party, and this was during World War II as well. Part of his presidency occurred during World War II. So he was, very popular. He was elected, FDR was elected to 4 terms as president, back to back, 4 terms. Now, FDR didn't finish out or serve his last term entirely because he died in office. So he only served part of that term. But nonetheless, FDR was elected to 4 successive terms, which is pretty incredible. The only time in the nation's history. So in the aftermath of that, in the aftermath of FDR serving these 4 terms, Congress said, look, we can't have this. We've got to change this. So they enacted the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution, and that was around 1950. So the 22nd Amendment is what imposed only 2 terms. So today, the president can only serve as 2 terms as a result of FDR. But back then, at Washington's time, there was no 22nd Amendment and there were no term limits. So Washington was free to serve, to run for a 3rd term. So this act of Washington, of voluntarily stepping down from the president and voluntarily giving up power, was one of the most extraordinary acts in history. And it was really what made George Washington one of the greatest figures in history and one of the greatest of the founding fathers.